But I mean, how dare you read that? And it's like, dude, you're reading. Good job, you get a cookie. So yeah, it's. Go ahead real quick, and I'm gonna get.
From what I recall, when the Sultanate was set up in Egypt by the Muslims, there were still around 200,000 scrolls, papyri, books, other remnants of the library there. And the Sultan at the time said, if it agrees with the Quran, it's unnecessary, so burn it. If it doesn't agree with the Quran, it's apostate, heretical, so burn it. So everything that was left disappeared then.
What year was that?
I don't recall which Sultans it was, whether it was the Mamluks or the earlier.
The sources of all of this that we know about it are so vague, and they all argue against each other. That is one of the main theories, but nobody knows for sure. But it is pretty clear that you're right, and I don't have the name of the man who did it, but that it was the Christian. Do you know the name of the Christian in Alexandria? At the time, they were destroying the pagan temples around 390.
Well,
AD.
Constantinus II.
Starts with a T.
Theodosius.
Theodosius. No? Would that be
Theodosius was Eastern Roman Emperor in the late 4th century.
Oh, no, it wasn't Theodosius. It wasn't an
That's why you don't ask the nuclear engineer these
Yeah. It doesn't matter. But it was the strongest clue that they have, that it, at least from what I was reading, was that the last of them, the last of the documents went in the Christian purge of the pagans.
Yes, ma'am, real quick.
They didn't just store the books there, they kept making copies. If it had lasted for another couple hundred years, there may have been a lot more copies of this that were distributed around, so it wouldn't have all gone up in smoke at the same time.
One of my favorite stories that the Pharaoh at the time that the library was being built had established a rule. Every time a ship comes into port or anybody comes visiting, they surrender all their books. Their books all get copied, go into the library. The originals go into the library. The copies go back to the people who own the books.
I never heard that.
Yeah.
I'm gonna have to start that.
we got a bookstore.
2 or 3 cons, I can hook a brother up. Yeah. All right, Jay, it's your turn.
Well, I'll do one that's it's a little more ridiculous, but it's kind of fun to think about. And I think it's even in a video game somewhere, where at the end of the Revolutionary War, George Washington had a tremendous amount of power, tremendous amount of clout. It sort of reminds me of World War I at the end in 1919. Woodrow Wilson was one of the most famous people in the world for about 5 months. Like, he was the man. He just had that. Washington had that sort of, and you always wonder. But he gave up the power. There was certain people would call for, what if you should be the next monarch? You should be the king. You always hear that story. Well, what if he just flipped out and said, you know what, I'm going to be a tyrant. I am going to take over. And let's just, it's a ridiculous notion, but just assume for a moment that he had the military strength and he got all his people backing him up, and he did it, and he took over. What would happen? I think the first things, that he would have to do if he wanted to maintain power is to get rid of all the people that had enough power to oppose this action, which would be, Jefferson, those guys, Monroe, well, maybe not in those days, a little bit later he had more power, Adams, people like that would be like, what the heck are you doing? Franklin, all those guys. Which, of course, would mean, one of the great things, Jefferson and Monroe, when they went over to France to later on, maybe a decade or so later, and to be ambassadors, they, were instrumental in creating good relations with France and securing the Louisiana Treaty. That wouldn't have happened, at least not for a while. It probably might not have happened at all. They more or less, they were sort of a general policy of, we beat the British, but we don't have to destroy them into the ground in every single opportunity. Of course, you talk about, later when the British started conscripting soldiers leading to the 1812 and the cotton and the trade and everything.
I mentioned already that.
What's that?
I already mentioned that.
You already? Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah.
I was looking at you.
Look at me.
I was looking at you. And so, they would have a tremendous lack of goodwill as far as that goes. Also, I think, one of the things that people sort of generally made fun of the U.S. in the original thing was, you don't have, your experiment's going to fail. It's complete crap. It's not going to work. And they would have been sort of proven right if it from the very get-go, and that would have created, extra tensions overseas. Basically, it would be interesting. I feel like he would have enough military power, and the British would probably have had enough warfare to leave us alone for a while, but eventually it's going to collapse in on itself.
Well, because at the end of the war, because Congress had finally ran off to, I think, York, Pennsylvania, because Philadelphia had fallen and everything else. And there was a point in time where the Army hadn't been paid since before Yorktown. It's been like 6 months. It's like, we haven't been home to raise any crops, There's still Tories running around burning stuff. We want to either go home or get our checks. And Congress was like, we have nothing to give you. And a bunch of the general officers came to Washington and said, if you want to go ahead and big man in charge, we've got your back.
Yeah.
We'll go in and bayonet the entire Congress right now.
Yeah, love
And the entire Army will follow us. So, I mean, that's literally one of those, and given the way, you have to think of America in 1785 as a big bubble. We are ready to expand outward. We've been hemmed in by the Appalachians for a generation. We're ready to go. People have already, Richard Henderson went to Kentucky and pretty much, for a couple of magic beans, said, yeah, we'll buy the entire state.
We have the tools, we have the talent.
And I mean, Isaac Shelby did the same thing in Tennessee, yeah. Here's a cow, we want everything from here to the Mississippi, wherever that is. So I think you would have had Washington in that mid-Atlantic area around here real strong. But once you cross the mountains, it would have been every man for himself. And like you said, and the British aren't stupid. I mean, it's going to take them a decade to get their strength back.
Yeah.
They do have Napoleon to deal with.
Well,
Yeah.
but
That's right.
But you have no example
General Napoleon.
to in fact to defeat the flames of the revolution in France. I mean, there is no example that shows you can take out a tyrant and still have a functioning government. There is no example of that because Washington's in charge. So you wouldn't have necessarily had Napoleon come up because France would have stayed stable.
And Monroe and Dubois, they were supporters of the revolution for that reason.
Well, but maybe not.
But the revolution's over at this point, though.
No, the French Revolution.
Yeah.
Right.
But by this point, Jefferson, Washington's ready to go on a rampage. Well, like I say, 10 years later, if they don't have to deal with Napoleon right after the Wars of the Revolution, why not come back? I mean, it was touch and go until
There were some areas that
1815.
there were some areas that might have wanted them back.
Yeah.
And I think New England would probably put up a big fight if Washington had declared himself.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But by the same token, at that time, Washington, New England had been hit so hard, and the Mid-Atlantic had been hit so hard by the war. What are they going to do?
Yeah, Washington was so clever. I mean, he was so keen, so politically savvy at how he balanced things. I just have to think if he would have really decided to do it, he would have built the support to make it happen.
I think so too. I think he would have had to kill a lot of people.
I don't know that he would, but
Well,
you're the historian, not
support-
me. I do think it's ironic that we would have had King George I on this side of the river and King George III on the other.
Yeah,
Nice.
yeah.
I like that.
Yes.
So you all talked about political, points in a pivot, and technological or knowledge points of pivot. What about natural disasters? And how would those? Can you say like if this natural disaster didn't occur, then you have to look at it in terms of what political and technology changes? Like for an example of like if the Titanic never sank.
Okay, I'll give you a better one than that. There's an actual science fiction writer, who I can't remember the name right now. He wrote one based on the Black Death. The idea was the Black Death killed, what, 50 million people, like 1/4?
Tim Stanley Robinson.
Was that right?
Yes, sir.
And his premise was that it killed almost all of Europe. It decimated Europe like 80% or something of Europe, maybe 75%, I forgot what it was. Maybe you remember. But it destroyed Europe so much that Europe didn't have an industrial revolution. The countries that are in charge are Japan and some other countries, but not Europe. So there's a natural disaster someone's played off.
Yeah, because I mean, you even mentioned the Renaissance, where the Renaissance came about. One of the causes they say is because after the Black Plague, there were so few people to be able to raise the crops and whatnot. They had more space, they had more ability to higher wages and get a middle class.
The argument I remember reading about the Renaissance was that the Medici family decided they had a lot of money because they did a bunch of things that ended up being the banker to the Pope. So there was enough graft around that they were really, really rich. And they decided to impress all their neighbors by having all the best scientists and artists and sculptors do stuff for them. And that everybody to compete had to do the same things. You all of a sudden had a critical mass in Florence.
But those folks were there to be hired by these people because they came from Constantinople.
Don't argue that.
Yeah.
I don't know where they came from.
Well, another good example, closer to home, is the New Madrid quake, 1811. That had not happened